G'day guys, we are on the beautiful Lake Awoonga, Central Queensland near Gladstone, and in the past I've done Barramundi basic videos for you guys so that I can give you basic tips and basic instructions on I guess there's been multiple different things. There's been like a jerk baiting video, a swim baiting video, what to look for on the weed edge, stuff like that. So start of the new season and there are so many new things I need to tell you about. So this is going to be my first Barramundi Basics video for this season, and I'll try and cover a lot of things. If there's more things that you want information about, or I touch on it too briefly, or even you think that I go too far ahead for you guys, then make sure you note it in the comments or shoot me a message so that I can then touch on that later on.
Oh my god. Oh my.
So I'll start with some of the basics, I guess, for the Barramundi Basics video. So I'll run through rod, reel, line, leader, then I'll get to the new exciting things about these lures. For this video, I'm just going to cover my bait caster setup. I'm not going to go into my spin, we can do that another time. So my main go-to rod is my Swimbait rod. It's a 795 Dobbins Fury Swimbait rod. It's a 795 SB, which stands for Swimbait rod. So 7'9" and a power level of 5. But as far as casting the mollusk shad, this thing is beautiful and very sort of forgiving in the tip. It's not a super hard, crisp rod. So once you set the hook and load it, you're not going to be too worried about when a fish jumps that rod's going to unload and the chance of spitting the hook. So my reel, Akuma Komodo 364P. You'd recognise that from a lot of my Barramundi videos last season and also all my cod stuff. So it's a 300 size reel. So I like to change my handle over to a longer arm with this Gemexis style handle. And the main reason of that is it slows me down and I don't have to think about it. The 364, if you buy the P model, comes with a power handle, which is already a single arm, a big power knob, so you got plenty of purchase on it when you get that strike. But the arm for me, I feel when it comes to like the mind-numbing process of casting and retrieving and not having to think, if I just extend that arm, it's literally probably 10 or 15 mil, it's not much, but that slows me down to where my normal retrieve, I don't have to think about it. So my braid, I'm running a 50-pound Sunline Castaway. I basically just run this 50-pound braid on my 300 size reels for everything, for Murray cod, Barramundi, anything on my Swimbait tackle, I'm running this 50-pound Castaway. And it's a nice fine line anyway, but 50-pound isn't so much for the fish that you're chasing, it's for the little accidents you have during the night with a backlash, or when you're chucking big swim baits. Even at 140, if you give that a full send with the wind behind you, you'll pop it off if you don't have a quality braid that you trust, or you're running down as low as 30 pound. For the leader, I'm running Sunline again in the FC 100, and it's a fluorocarbon leader. That's what FC stands for. It's very, very tough and very abrasion resistant line. So I like to run 60 pound. You don't need to go any higher to 80. You will get a little bit of marking and stuff on the 60 when they inhale it all the way from like a really big fish, and I will retie after that just because I don't like to see that scuffing on my line at all. But you don't always need to retie. So I've had 60 pound where I've caught multiple fish that have inhaled it and I haven't bothered to retie. But if running 60, if you retie all the time after catching a big fish with any chafage on your line, I shouldn't say you'll never get chafed off, but I haven't been chafed off. So I just run 60. I find it's nice, it's light, it ties really nice, neat knots because it's not so big. And when you come for like a natural presentation or you want the lure to sink naturally, going down as light as you can go is ideal. You know, if you could go to 40 and get away with it, you would. Obviously the lighter the leader, you get less resistance in the water in front of your bait, so your bait's just going to swim a lot more natural. Now, speaking of the baits, we'll get down to the lures. So there's a couple of new things this season already. So this, you'll notice, this is the mollusk shad in the Ghost Bass, which was very successful for me last year. The difference is at the moment, this is a 120 Ghost Bass. A little bit smaller than the 140, which is fine, but a lot lighter than the 140, which is the main the main reason that I've gone to the 120. So I've only been to the lake twice already this season. This is our third night now. And we're fishing a lot shallower than we were last season, and later on as this year progresses and the weed grows, you're going to be back to that 140 and you're going to be wide of the weed. But right now, we're literally sitting in about 3.5 meters and I'm throwing into probably a foot of water, and I'm expecting a bite within that 3 foot of water depth, you know. So that 140, you would just need to probably wind it a little bit too fast at the moment. So that's where the 120 is perfect. So there's a couple of other things you might have noticed about my 120 shad is the brown hooks and the brown rings. So I'm running Van Fook DT68 trebles. That's a size 1 and a size 2 on the rear. These are PTFE coated, so they're super slippery. They're a very strong gauge hook, but they're just so sticky, which is why I like them, and they're strong. Also like the fact that they're brown. Always get in your mind about running silver, has that bit of flash, you know, you're fishing freshwater, and with the cod, I try and steer away from anything silver. It's probably in my own mind because last season I fished silver hooks on all my barra tackle as well. But if I can get away from silver, I will, just for naturalness, you know. And the rings are the same. They're the same size 4 Van Fook rings that I've always run, but I just recently worked out they make brown ones as well. So I'll swap them over to the brown as well to make them even more natural. So now to the most exciting part of this new season. So I spent most of the beginning of this year, I guess, designing a new colour for mollicks. So last September, if you remember some of my videos from last September, basically my boat looked like I've been crabbing all day. So the boat was full of claws and heads and tails even from red claw. So nearly every barramundi we caught September last year coughed up red claw. The whole boat was full of them, it stunk, and I really wanted to have a bait that I felt would imitate a red claw so I could capitalise on that bite more than anything. So that was September last year. This year the lake is a little bit different and I'm not 100% sure what it's going to be like, but I spent the first part of this year designing a red claw coloured mollick shad. I was very particular about exactly what a very clean, like a clear water red claw looked like. It was very important for me about the UV to be on it and the red and the blue. This is the only one that I own. So I have a few more coming in the mail. This is the actual prototype they sent me to check the colour. So as you can see, it's a red claw swimming backwards, which is the way it would dart off in a panic. So it has a red, which is UV, blue, which is UV, and then these colourways on the side. I chose to go the red eye, and then, as with most of the colours I've found successful, I like a little bit of glitter in them. So I've got glitter and then that foil on the cheek plate. Because we're fishing super shallow, I'm only running the 1 ring off that front rather than the 2, because I'm trying to keep that hook as tight to the lure as possible. And then what I've also done so far this season, after Troy's little incidences at Mondrian last season, is I'm just running a loop knot to the lure. So no clip, but a loop knot. As you can see with this, it's very free on the front of that lure, so there'll be no interference with that lure. If you tie straight to that and it sits a little bit crooked, the lure's not going to swim exactly how you want. You keep that loop there nice and free, that lure can do everything that you want it to do. As with last season, I still like to cut off this top hook. I believe I jump too many off and I find I end up snagging up on that hook. And then a treble on the rear where the split ring, where the Colorado blade was, sorry. And then I cut off my little fins just to give it that extra bit of roll. And once you get a feel of the 120 as well, it feels a little bit different in the water. A lot more vibration pumping out of the 120 than there is from the 140. It's a lot tighter action. If you've already seen our first video from this season, you'll know that the red claw colour already works. So I have a very good feeling that this colour is going to smack them this year. So enough talking about it, about the tackle anyway. I'll go to the back of the boat now and I'll show you how and why I've positioned myself where I am, and we'll run through the retrieve. So what I've done here is I've got the wind basically blowing straight over my shoulder against the bank, and I don't like to be ever casting across the wind, because your main line will get a belly in it, and either A, you won't have enough control over it when you hit that weed to get out of that weed, and B, if you get a tap and all it does is pull up that slack, when you go to strike, that fish has already jumped and spat it out. So the first thing I like to do, note the direction of the wind when you drive down the dam, and position yourself on the wind-blown side, which is what everybody talks about. There's multiple reasons for that. 1, warmer water. 2, bait. And also 3, when you get on a bank like this, you get mud lines and disturbed water from all the waves hitting it. Then, of course, you want to have the wind, as I said, straight over your shoulder, so your line to your lure is dead straight. So even in the windiest days, the wind doesn't affect you because you're fishing dead straight to the wind. So at the moment, we're only in 3 meters of water. We're actually in 4 meters of water. And the main weed bed and fish that we've seen on the way in, they're all sitting out there, but that's not where they're feeding. They're feeding in here. So what we have in this section is we have what they call a mud line. So behind me is a muddy red rock sort of clay bank, and you have all these waves breaking on it, and then that muddy water and disturbed water is slowly floating along here and along this bank where there is no mud, but now there's a lot of muddy water, and that acts as, I guess you could call it, like it's cover for the fish, it's cover for the bait, and they use that mud line to hunt. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and land behind that mud line and bring my lure out into the clear. The idea is to keep your lure as close to the bottom as possible. You want to be just above the bottom when you're at the initial part of this retrieve, where I'm on probably sand or gravel bottom, and then as you get out a little bit, you're going to be just ticking along the top of those weed towers. You want to understand your retrieve speed that it takes for you to tick weed. So you're going to do a few casts that I guess what you call sacrificial casts, where you start to understand the area that you're fishing, and you're going to start to understand what speed you need to be to just tick the top of that weed. You don't want to be getting buried in it like I am right now. You want to be just ticking over the top of it. So after your lure hits the water, you can let it sink and work out how many seconds it takes to hit the bottom. So they hit the bottom within 3 seconds. So now I know to not pick up anything, I can only let that lure sink sort of 1 to 2 seconds. Then I start into my retrieve. So now I know I've just hit that first bit of weed, and all I like to do is just simply crank my handle to pop it off that single piece of weed. I don't want to be messing it around and going like that to get the weed off, because I don't like to talk in percentages, but a high percentage of your fish are going to come as your lure flicks off that piece of weed. So when you crank the handle like that, your lure's going to rip off that weed and jump forward. And any fish that are hanging around the bottom of that weed looking up for that ambush, they're going to instantly be triggered by that lure popping off. And if you have your rod loaded and it's got heaps of weed on it, or you let it sink even further into the weed and you pull the whole weed tower over, they're probably going to move away before your lure pops off. Or when you rip it off really hard, you're likely to pull heaps of that weed off, or even take your lure completely out of the picture for them and they don't get to see it, and it's just not natural. Whereas it looks like to them, when you hit that piece of weed, it's like a bait fish either attacking something, or it's even chewing on that piece of weed and just breaking a piece off. What I really like about the Mollick shad, which is unique to a lot of other lures, and I think that's why I get a lot of triggered fish on this lure, is it's flat-sided and sort of, I guess you could call it semi-unbalanced. So when you pop this lure, or you crank the handle to pop this lure, it doesn't just swim straight ahead. It actually deflects, it rolls, it spins, it does all sorts of stuff. If you put it in a pool and have a look, you really get a good understanding about why this lure is so good at triggering fish. So basically at the moment, I'm not really expecting to get a fish, because it's about bite times, which I think I should touch on bite times in another video, but not going into too much detail about bite times. There is always a bite window or a feeding time at Awoonga at change of light. Basically, you'll hook that fish when you can see. By the time you net it, get it in the boat, and you're sort of high-fiving each other, whatever, you won't be able to see. So that's the change of light I mean, not when that sun hits the horizon, more from when it goes to when you can see with your eyes to when you can't see. That bite is always here, regardless if the main bite time is at midnight. There is always something that you will catch at sunset. Barramundi is an inhalation feeder, which means they inhale all their food, all their bait, everything. They suck in a whole lot of water and everything around it and then close their mouth on it. So a bite from a barramundi is relatively subtle. You will feel them close their jaw, or possibly the lure hit them in the back of the throat. What you won't feel is a big hard jaw crunching hit like you imagine you would, unless. So when they're feeding and you're in the right scenario, it's a bite time and your lure is correct, they're going to inhale that lure all the time. And the bite, like I said, will be very, very subtle. It'll be a little tap, or more like what I like to call a double tap. And it's very, very important when you get that double tap that you set the hooks, because that fish has its jaw tight on your line and that lure sitting in its crushing pads in the back of its throat. And as soon as it feels that that's not natural, it's going to jump and spit your lure out, and before you can tell your mate you had a bite, you don't have a fish. It's gone. It's jumped off. You look at your leader and you have a little bit of mark about 3 or 4 inches above your leader, and you wonder, how did you miss it? So it's very important. The subtlest, tiniest little ticks, double taps on your line, just hit it. Move that lure in their mouth so that the trebles find their lips or their jaw on their way out before they get to spit it out. The second sort of bite, which I find very useful and is actually fairly nasty, is what I like to call like a triggered bite. It's a triggered response from a fish that's not necessarily feeding, or your bait's not quite right. They are a fairly intense, hard hit, and similarly, you need to set the hook on them before they, I guess they're not going to really jump off, but before they realise they're hooked and they take off. They may jump, they may not, but you need to get the hook into the fish, past the barb, before they realise it. So what I mean by a triggered bite is it's like a headbutt bite, where they'll headbutt it with the front of their nose, or a cheek swipe where they're trying to smack it to get it out of their way. And all of those are typically either triggered by you with what I like to do with that popping with the handle. Sometimes I'll even pop my rod just for the sake of it, if I'm bored or I feel like there's fish there. But the main thing is it's a triggered response from fish. When you pop off that weed and they're sitting underneath it, you'll trigger them to smack it, or like I said, I'll pop the handle like that and it will trigger a following like inquisitive fish to smack it. Or literally, if you keep it tracking, like I said, as close to the bottom, as close to the weed as possible, you're also in the zone where they're swimming. So when you cross paths with the fish, even if it's not a feeding fish, you have that opportunity to trigger that fish by just being too close to it and being in its face, and you will draw a response from that fish. And majority of the time, those responses are what I call like a cheek swipe or a face swipe. The lure will literally be stuck to the side of their gill plates, and those triggered ones where I've popped the handle or I've flicked it off weed or whatever are when that fish, he's nosing that lure and following you out of the weed, but he hasn't committed to it, and you've given him a triggered response for him to commit. Typically that ends up with that tail treble through the tip of his nose, and a cheek swipe one will end up with either one of those pinned to the side of his face. And it's very tough on your gear when they hit with those sorts of ones, because you got 2 sets of hooks, they're all screwed up. When they come up and jump, that's when you have a chance of like straightening hooks or pulling hooks. But if you just play it out and you have a nice rod like this sort of thing that's forgiving, I've caught big fish with just one treble through their cheek plate on some of the most painful fights. So as annoying as it is, you want to be catching this weed, and you don't want to be catching it sort of every cast. And like if you have this much on your lure, yes, it's going to affect your lure. If you have this much, that's fine, you know. You're still going to catch a fish with a little bit of weed on there like that, but you do want to be picking up that weed sort of every third or fourth cast. You definitely want to be picking up that weed, otherwise you're not in the area. So one very important thing which I tell a lot of people, and they may or may not listen to too much, is you need to cast, you need to find an area like this that we're fishing and cast in that exact same spot over and over again. They say the definition of stupidity is you do the same thing twice and expect a different outcome. Well, that's barramundi fishing. You need to be hitting that same spot every cast, and when you first get to a spot, if there's a couple of you and you haven't fished an area before, you can have one person sort of hitting one particular area for a while and they can move a little bit, but one person needs to be casting straight down that line, hitting that exact same spot every cast. And the point of that is, especially on a bank like this, we're not on a point and we're not in a bay. We're just on a hard line with muddy water and current running past us. So these fish, they're not going to be staying here. Yes, they'll be feeding there, but they'll be moving past us all the time. And if I decide to fan cast over here to my right, then a fan cast a bit to my left, then a pack of 4 or 5 fish come through, they just about get to where I'm casting, and then I decide to start casting over there again, well, I just missed them. So ideally, pick a spot, keep hitting it over and over, and the advantage of hitting the exact same spot over and over, as boring as it gets, you literally understand every single thing in the waterway back to you. You understand where each weed tower is, how big it is, what part of your retrieve, how fast you're going, like at the start, middle and the end. So you get to really understand that area. So that's basically, I guess, barramundi basics for Awoonga. So if you want any other information, or you think I glossed over some stuff too much, just let me know in the comments and I'll cover it in the next one. What I might do is put up like a questionnaire on my socials or even in my community tab about things that you think will help you catch more barramundi. It's the very start of the season. It's only in September at the moment. Right now we're coming up to the new moon, which is also not ideal. You want to be fishing lead up to the full, but we are here. I know a lot of you guys will be coming as well. So it's the middle to the end of September now. So we have, I guess, probably 5 or 6 months even. We have all the way through to March fishing here. So plenty of time to fish here. A lot's going to change. A lot of lures are going to change. And probably not so much techniques, and definitely not any of the basics that I've told you in this. You're always going to be windblown point, cutting them off in the path that they run, and more than likely be running soft plastic Swimbait. Thanks as always for tuning in. I hope some of these tips will help you put you either onto your first barramundi or even just improve your next session to Awoonga. But stay tuned for us this season. We're going to try and catch some fish now, and we'll be barramundi fishing at least once a week.